tonight, as well as the 2004 Richmond Quest program at the university, which is co-sponsoring tonight's presentation. I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening for the first session of this 2004-2005 Jepson Leadership Forum series. We have an exciting series of programs planned between now and the end of February, focused on the American presidency and the challenge of leading and governing. In addition to tonight's program, over the course of the next several months, we will explore, among other topics, the challenges of presidential leadership, which is a topic of tomorrow night, leadership lessons from the lives and times of presidents, which will be the debut presentation for the James McGregor Burns lecture, as well as a number of sessions dealing with critical choices for the next administration, including such areas as public education, human rights, and health care. I understand there are brochures available in the lobby describing these sessions, and I hope that you'll be able to join us for these special events as well. As we are currently in the midst of the presidential election campaign, a time when it's probably just about impossible not to hear about the results of polls, and at times they're conflicting results, and I think probably we've all heard about the conflicting results last week with Pew and the Gallup Poll. For us, it's very, very timely that we have with us tonight one of the most preeminent authorities on polling and public opinion in America. Dr. Frank Newport, the editor-in-chief of the Gallup Poll and vice president of the Gallup organization, which is one of the most influential polling groups in the nation. At this juncture, I'd also like to acknowledge that we have another important member of the national polling community with us here tonight, and that's Dr. Charles S. Keeter, Associate Director of the Pew Research Center for the People and the Press. Charles? Dr. Keeter joined Dr. Newport this afternoon in a conversation with students and faculty exploring the issue of political polling and Decision 2004. Are we asking the right questions? And that's actually an offshoot of the Richmond Quest theme this year. Are we asking the right questions? Dr. Keeter, thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon and joining us this evening. And maybe later he may have some comments about our speaker tonight as well. Now, I'm guessing that many of you are here tonight to learn about Dr. Newport's reading of the latest polls with respect to the race for the White House. And I suspect that that will be a major focus of attention in the discussion tonight. I am certainly interested in his insights with respect to these issues as well. However, as a leadership scholar and a social scientist trained in many of the same research methods and approaches as Dr. Ford, I am perhaps more interested in his views on how public opinion polling affects the ways in which presidents and others in positions of authority and power lead and govern in a democratic society. In other words, my concerns are with what happens after the election season is over. That is, how the results of public opinion polling affect our next president, as well as members of Congress, as they enact their roles as leaders of the nation. Now, I'm not one to promote books, especially ones I haven't written, but I did get a chance to read through most of Frank Newport's recently published book entitled Polling Matters: Why Leaders Must Listen to the Wisdom of the People. And I highly recommend it to you. I enjoyed the book, not because I agree with all the positions and arguments presented within it. In all candor, I even have difficulty with the title of the book, in which poll results appear to be equated with wisdom. And for me, data is not wisdom, but information. But regardless of whether or not I agree or disagree with his viewpoints, I can say this: Frank raises the right questions and addresses the central concerns that many Americans have about polling and its effects on leadership in a democratic society. The underlying controversies he addresses reflect many of the same issues that the founding fathers of this country debated as our Constitution was prepared, and the likes of James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and others wrote about in the Federalist Papers. In a nutshell, and this is going to be a nutshell, it all boils down to the following. To what extent should the voice or advice of the people, especially in between elections, be heard and considered by presidents and other leaders as they develop policy and make governmental decisions that affect our lives in this country and other peoples around the world. As Frank Newport suggests in his book, there has never been any agreement in this country on the degree to which elected representatives should consider public opinion on a regular basis in their actions and decision-making. His own perspective is clear, however, and he asserts that, and I quote, "If a society is to prosper and move forward in an optimally adaptive fashion, it is vital that those charged with decision-making take the people's views into account on as systematic and frequent basis as possible." Not surprisingly, he believes that public opinion polls are an efficient and effective mechanism to provide leaders with information reflecting the voice of the people. And he argues, along with the late George Gallup, that the country will not suffer when its leaders begin to pay a lot of attention to public opinion polls. Rather, he suggests that the country will suffer when its leaders ignore or guess about the public's views and make wrong estimates of their knowledge. Obviously, there's another side to this issue as well, and that is that presidents and other leaders will not make tough decisions and move the country forward in innovative, productive directions because they are always looking over their shoulders at the results of the latest public opinion polls, which are purported to represent the wisdom of the people. Now, for brevity's sake, I've really simplified matters quite a bit, and I apologize to Dr. Newport for that. However, I hope that these and other important issues about leadership and public opinion polling addressed by Dr. Newport in his book are the foci of your attention tonight, along with the results of polls related to the current election campaign. I know we are all interested in that. At this point, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the background of our speaker this evening. Dr. Newport is one of the world's foremost experts on American public opinion polling, and since 1990 has served as editor-in-chief of the Gallup Poll, the nation's oldest continuing polling organization. He also serves as a feature analyst on CNN's Gallup Poll segments and has appeared widely on television and radio programs as a guest speaker on public opinion, politics, and polling. In fact, I don't know if you heard him this morning, but he was on NPR's Morning Edition talking about the Gallup polls and some of the recent results and distinctions between polls. Dr. Newport received a BA in broadcasting from Baylor University and an MA and PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan. During his career, he has taught sociology at the University of Missouri St. Louis, served as a full-time talk show host at KTRH Radio in Houston, and was a partner and head media research director in Houston Marketing Public Opinion Research Company. He has published scholarly articles in journals such as the American Sociological Review, Social Forces, and Public Opinion Quarterly. He co-authored the Evangelical Voter, Religion, and Politics in the United States, and in July of this year, his book, Polling Matters, was published by Warner Books. Finally, I should mention that I just learned a few hours ago that this is not Frank Newport's first visit to this campus. He was here for the 1992 presidential debate involving Bill Clinton, George Bush Sr., and Ross Perot. And it's my understanding that he was responsible for those people that were ticketed or allowed into the debate. And there were actually more people who showed up than there was room for, and somehow, I'm sure in a very magnanimous kind of way, he was able to manage that process. So please join me in welcoming Frank Newport back to the University of Richmond and to the Jepson Leadership Forum.
Thank you very much, Fred. And I think we're ready to move to questions now. Somebody giving a good summary of what we want to talk about tonight. I appreciate it very much. I enjoyed Fred and many of the others here this afternoon in the seminar that we talked about. And also, is this working? Hello, test 1, 2, 3. All right, now it is. And also in the at our reception that we had at the Jepson School. It's a beautiful school. that I remember well. Fred mentioned that I was here back in 1992 when the debate was held. We learned quickly, Gallup organization, learned quickly about the power of being on television, I guess is one way to look at it. If you want to look at it a little more positively, we learned quickly about how much value there was on the part of Richmond area residents in being a part of the ongoing debate and presidential election process. This was the first time in recent years that the Commission on Presidential Debates had proposed and we executed a town hall format. You may remember where we had actual real people, as I call them, up on the stage asking questions of the candidates at that time, Bush, Clinton, and Ross Perot. The first time we have done it, I've done a lot of focus groups in my days, and those of you who are familiar with focus groups realize that you always have no-shows. So you always over-recruit. If you want 10 people around the table talking about Procter & Gamble soap products, and you've got the executives behind the glass who are watching the discussion, you want to make sure 10 people actually show up. So you consistently and usually over-recruit. It's very standard. You recruit 15 people because inevitably there are no-shows. People get sick, they back out, they're in a traffic jam, they have a wreck or what have you, so they don't show up. So we did the same thing here. They had, I believe, I don't remember the exact number, but let's say hypothetically 110 seats at Robbins Center, right, here on campus, ready and available. We over-recruited because we figured there'd be no shows. Every single person showed up. So there we were at Gallup, along with some other people outside Robbins Center, saying, well, sorry, we can't use all of you on stage tonight. We have too many, thinking big deal, but we almost had a riot on our hands. But Fred alluded to, these people had gotten babysitters, they bought a new dress, they had told their relatives and friends they were going to national television, they were going to actually be able to ask a question of Bill Clinton or Ross Perot or George H.W. Bush. And we really had a major problem on our hands, and initially we had not even made provisions for them to come into the venue at all at Robbins Center. So finally we managed to get them seats up in the balcony and cool them out. I think somebody probably went around and handed out $100 bills to keep the lawsuits from occurring, but we learned our lesson. We did the same procedure in 1996 at the University of San Diego. Pretty boring debates. It was Clinton and Dole, not much question about that election. Clinton had the whole time that he was handling. And we did it at Washington University at St. Louis in 2000. It was Gore and Bush, and that was a close race, as you well remember. That was a debate where I believe Gore kind of approached Bush menacingly, remember, and Bush kind of looked at him strangely like that. And Gore did some other things which probably sealed his doom in terms of ultimately at least losing the electoral college part of that election. But in both of those instances, we learned our lesson that we did still over-recruit, but we were very careful to tell people, when you come, there is a possibility you will not be able to be in the debate, but if so, we will make provision for you to sit and watch and what have you. By the way, we are in the middle of the same process now. This afternoon I was taking phone calls from various people because finally the campaigns have apparently agreed to 3 debates proposed by the Commission on Presidential Debates this year. And the middle debate, again, at Washington University in St. Louis, is the proposed town hall format. And Gallup will again be recruiting people, uncommitted voters, we'll come back to that in a moment, to the debate. So in the middle of that again, we will again make sure we have provisions if we over-recruit to make sure they have something to do with it. We figured it's better to over-recruit than to have empty chairs or have to rush around and take chairs out at the last minute if people didn't show up. We won't get into that now. We've always called them uncommitted voters, and we received our document that had been agreed to by the 2 campaigns in Section 7, subsection F. Get the document. You can download the PDF file online. Section 7, subsection F, they have now told us that the people to be recruited this year will be considered soft carry and soft core voters. So we're not sure what that is. And I was on the phone with reporters this afternoon and said, well, what are they? I said, I have no idea. The 2 campaigns have not told us yet what they had in mind for soft voters, so that's something we're going to have to figure out. But I do hope that nothing goes wrong and that we end up 2 weeks from Friday. It'll be the second debate. Actually, we use the same procedures there at Washington University in St. Louis. We'll come back to the presidential race. Fred alluded to it in his kind introduction a moment ago. Not a lot of people are interested in where the race stands right now, but I think it's important. To me, what was fascinating about the opportunity to be here was that this evening, this day, this venue tonight, this speech, this occasion seemed to have a nice cross between a couple of things that are of great interest to me. And that's leadership on the one hand and the presidency on the other, both of which are part of the series tonight. And I think the 2 form a real interesting and important component of how we look at American society today, just as Fred alluded to. So I want to spend some time here talking about the presidency, A lot of what we're talking about certainly relates to senators, elected U.S. Congress people, and state representatives, but we're going to talk for the most part about senators, about the presidency, and also what the role of leadership means to the presidency today and how public opinion polling has in the past and can fit into that in the future. Then, at some point near the end, we'll leave plenty of room for questions. We'll talk about the race for president in 2004. I learned something when I was at West Palm Beach, I think it was last year, making a speech to some group, and Jeff Greenfield, who was a commentator on CNN, made the speech immediately after me. And I had prepared and had lots of comments and what have you, and Jeff ambled up to the podium and said, "It's great to be here, and I think the best way that people learn in speeches is to answer and have questions. So let's begin with the questions." And that was his entire speech for 45 minutes, was answering questions, which actually turned out to be pretty good. He's a very good speaker, quick on his feet. The questions were good, and it ended up making it a very interesting experience. So I want to make sure along those same lines that we leave plenty of room at the conclusion of our speech tonight for questions so we can talk. I've been told that we have till 3 in the morning. Is that right, at the venue? So for the purpose of convenience, I've divided my speech into 22 main headings and 122 subheadings, and we will now commence on heading. No. We'll try to be out of here first. The presidents in the real world, I want to use presidents as an example of my views about how polling fits into a democracy. And I thought it was of some interest to point out the fact that there is often a distinguishing line we can draw between what elected representatives do in the real world and what they say they do when it relates to public opinion and polling. A good friend of mine, and some of the others perhaps, political scientists at Lewis and Clark College out at Portland, Bob Eisinger, has written a book on the evolution of public opinion polling in the presidency. And I thought I would borrow a little from Bob and just show you what we have found out. Since FDR, as far as the historical record shows, almost every president has used public opinion polling while in office. And as far as we know, every single president has used public opinion polling as part of the election campaign. Gerald Ford did not use public opinion when he first became president, when Nixon resigned in August of 74, but as I'll show you in a minute, he certainly did use polling even in that brief period of time when he was president. He certainly used polling when he was running in 1976 for re-election against the governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter. It's kind of interesting to run down the path. People were very critical of Bill Clinton in some quarters when he was president of the United States. Why? He was poll-driven. Clinton, for the first time, we would hear, is now using polls to try to make decisions about what to do in office and what have you. And we remind people, and Bob's certainly research backs this up, that we go all the way back to FDR, and we find that when you really burrow into the historical records, he was a consistent user of public opinion polls. Harvey Cantrell, one of the founders of public opinion polling, along with George Gallup and some others, Elmo Roper and some others back at the origin of the species, was involved in helping give Franklin Roosevelt a sense of where the American public was at that time. Some of you in this audience are much more learned historians about Franklin Roosevelt's reign as president and about World War II, and probably may want to correct me on this, but it's clear that to some significant degree, public opinion polling probably was keeping Roosevelt back from the early entry of the United States into World War II, because there was significant isolationist sentiment reflected in the polls, reflected by a lot in Congress at that time, up until the time of Pearl Harbor. Harry Truman has something in common, the good Democrat Harry Truman, with the current president, George W. Bush. Neither of them professed publicly to like polls. I thought I'd put a comment up for Truman. A man who is influenced by the polls or is afraid to make decisions which may make him unpopular is not a man to represent the welfare of the country. How was that? And as far as Bob could see and others could see, Truman didn't pay much attention to polls. He did get reelected. Maybe he got sour on polls after the 1948 election because all the polls showed he was going to go down to shining defeat. Truman, of course, won. It was in all the history books, by the way. He won in 1948 and served another 4 years. However, his last 4 years weren't great ones. His job approval rating and other indicators were extremely low. In fact, the lowest job approval rating in Gallup history came in the Truman administration, 1 point below Nixon's right before Watergate. Eisenhower, good old Ike, a commanding general, a leader if there ever was one, did use polling. In his administration, a couple of different State Department running polls became very controversial because Congress said, why are you using State Department money to do polling? But nevertheless, part of what Bob found was that he was using polling to tell him what was going on in Korea. JFK loved polls. Lewis Harris was a great pollster in general, famous pollster, but also founder of the Harris poll, which Du divorced off from him. But nevertheless, Lou Harris polled both when he was running for office and after Kennedy got into office, along with some others, and told him things about Cuba and elsewhere. LBJ loved polls. I was reading some research, Robert Caro's multi-volume biography of Johnson, and it talks about how much he paid attention to polls and wanted polling results as far back as 1948, when he made his famous run for the Senate in Texas, and he won by about 2 votes. It makes the election in Florida in 2000 look like a landslide, and a number of the votes, according to historians, that LBJ won by were dead people, or people who voted 3 times down in the Rio Grande Valley, but that's a different story for a different speech. But nevertheless, he loved polls, and Johnson was an avid reader of public opinion. Nixon liked polls even more, for different reasons. I wish we had time to go into what we know about Nixon's use of polling, with his hunger for power as he had. But a friend of mine, still to this day, Harry O'Neill, who is a senior member of our polling fraternity that a lot of us here know, was actually one of Nixon's pollsters who fed him information. He actually got information to the Gallup organization. Some people say he slipped under the door to it. We don't think that was the case, but nevertheless, Nixon loved polls. Ford, I've talked about. Carter, a brilliant young man from Harvard named Pat Caddell with the beard. It was his pollster, helped him get elected in 1976. Carter liked Caddell, thought he was a brilliant strategist. Caddell went far beyond the data and began to be a substantial part of Carter's strategy thinking sessions in the White House. Perhaps the most famous result of Caddell's polling was when he came in midterm to Carter and said, you know, the public is extremely dissatisfied out there across America today. There's a malaise at work. So Carter famously, although I don't believe Carter used the word malaise in the speech, he put on a sweater and talked to the Americans. It has been called a malaise speech, but it was exactly the wrong word. The polling was right, but the interpretation that Carter should go before the public and say, I know we're all depressed and isn't it terrible and all this stuff, but was not what the public wanted to hear. In fact, the public likes, we've learned this year in particular, strong leaders and positive Norman Vincent Peale types, and that wasn't Carter. Nevertheless, Carter got defeated, by the way, in 1980, remember him with Caddell, but he was a big user of polls. Ronald Reagan didn't pay necessarily a lot of attention to him, but Richard Wortham, a famous pollster, in our community at any rate, did an enormous amount of polling for the White House, huge budget for the RNC, Republican National Committee, and what have you. George H.W. Bush with Robert Teeter, certainly, who became his campaign manager in '92, to no avail, went to meeting, used polls, looked at polls, paid attention to polls. Although I remember in the 1992 campaign, I was on the television program in the morning talking about polls, and to set it up, they played a clip of Bush, who hated polls by October of 1992. He was saying in some speech, polls, 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 I hate polls. Because at that time, all the polls were showing him losing to Bill Clinton. And they said, how do you react to that? So, but nevertheless, he used polls while he was on. Clinton's famous. He used polls up one side and down the other. Stanley Greenberg, a Yale professor, Dick Morris, a controversial, I don't know what Dick Morris is. But nevertheless, he was a pollster as part of it. He's a wild man thinker. I was just on a panel with him in New York where he almost screamed at Mario Cuomo for a variety of things. But Dick Morris famously gave him a lot of advice on his 1996 State of the Union address, which in fact was a very successful State of the Union address, and Clinton went on a very high job approval ratings in his second term. Supposedly, Clinton asked Morris, poll where I should go on vacation, Martha's Vineyard or Wyoming or somewhere like that, although I'm not sure that story's been verified. Some Republicans are arguing that maybe John Kerry should have polled before he went windsurfing, right, on Martha's Vineyard, which isn't exactly the sport of the common people in America today, but I don't think he polled on that. And finally, we're at George W. Bush, which I'll be talking about here in just a moment, who publicly says he doesn't use polls. Although his re-election campaign is spending probably $100 million on polling so far this year, my estimate, to try to figure out what to do. He doesn't use them. Karl Rove is the one, his campaign manager. Nevertheless, the disjuncture that I want to get to is that most of these presidents publicly don't own up to polls. You know, it's very, in fact, I do not recall, and maybe some historians in the audience can tell me there is a case when a president said, I'm proud to say that I've just been reading my polls and this is what it says that we should do in this situation, right? Most presidents downplay polls, they kind of hide the attention they pay to polling, if they pay attention at all, and don't talk about it publicly, even though, as we just saw, most presidents in recent modern days, when polling has been available, certainly to one degree or the other, avail themselves of polls. So we have a disjuncture. We have presidents, to some degree, using polls. Clearly, presidents rely on polls as part of their re-election campaign. Even the most avid politician who says, I would never pay attention to polls to tell me what to do as a leader, first hire when he or she is running for re-election is a pollster, right, as part of the campaign. So they certainly recognize the value of polls in the election milieu, but deny publicly to some significant degree the value of polls when it comes to day-by-day policy making and leadership within the White House itself. So there's a disjunction there, which I think, as Fred alluded to in the introduction there, is too bad. I think it's the idea that we have to be shameful about the idea that polls might have something to do with our thinking about vision and leadership and where we want to take the country, I think is not a positive state of affairs, and that's what I'm going to talk about for a little here as we go on. Our current occupant of the White House is a great, some of you here are Republicans, some Democrats, so by calling attention to Bush, I made sure I brought up the Democrat Harry Truman to show he had similar views. But Bush is in the White House now and has been very verbal and open about his disdain publicly for using polls, and I thought I would just look at how strong it gets for this side of the argument. This was in 92, excuse me, the date is wrong there, it's 2000, not 2002. This was literature when he was running the first time. I don't need polls, blah, 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 but he even went further than polls. What I thought was interesting, in this campaign literature, Bush said, I will not use my office to reflect public opinion. George Gallup used to say, when he was talking about the same things in the earlier age, that's very similar wording, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, to what Hitler and Mussolini had said as well, right? The public or ballot fodder, as he used to say. The people are dumb, they don't know what they're doing, we know what is best. Most dictators throughout history have used variants of that same kind of argument. I will make decisions based on what God tells me to do or what I know is best, and I won't pay any attention to the people. More recently, in Time magazine, Bush, if one thing you give Bush credit, he's steadfast in his views, right? We cannot find any variance on Bush on this. Great decisions are made with care, but not with polls. I do not know to take your pulse before I know what's on my mind, okay? Democrats in the audience probably are saying maybe he should, because what's on his mind they don't necessarily agree with. Republicans in the audience, and they would all be on the right side from my perspective. I assume that the audience was segregated today. I certainly think that's great, because what's on Bush's mind is a lot better than what's on his opponents. But nevertheless, this is an exemplar, I think, of this kind of verbalization of this anti-poll rhetoric, which we've heard a lot of. We heard a lot of it during the Clinton impeachment years, 1998, early 99. That, too, is in all the papers, you may remember, with Monica Lewinsky and what have you. But as Congress had to make the decision on the initial impeachment vote, and as senators then had to make the decision once he was impeached on whether to convict or not, there was a lot of hand-wringing and discussion publicly and in the media about what criteria, it was a great laboratory, about what criteria these elected representatives are going to use to make the decision. And in my book, I have a series of quotes that I pulled out at the time, where most of them were saying I would never refer to polls at this time to make this important decision. Bill Brown, the senator from Texas, said I would never, the good people of Texas didn't elect me to go up to Washington to pay attention to polls and so on and so forth. So this sentiment has been echoed not by Bush, he just happens to be the most current one who echoes it, but this sentiment has been echoed in a variety of sources by elected representatives throughout the years. Now in my book I talk about some of the reasons. I'm not a psychologist, some of you are. I think there is when you move into a role of power, you begin to assume that you're perhaps more brilliant than you were the day before you moved into the role, and I think that's part of it, right? Somebody's an average citizen, get elected to Congress, and all of a sudden they became the wisest person in America. And I think it's probably realistic that we realize that, like in the old days, when we would send somebody off to represent us at the state capitol, he's just one of us, or she's just one of us. When we send off to represent us, they come back, somebody else goes off to represent us. But nobody anoints them with an Einstein-like, razor-like brilliance and intellect simply because they take the oath of office as an elected representative. What's interesting, however, is that along these lines, I'll come to that in a moment. Somebody mentioned this a little earlier today. We have what we call the trustee model, which is really kind of what Bush is representing. Some of you have taken political science courses and have heard this discussed. It's the idea, I think I have a quote up here, from famous Englishman Edmund Burke that's quoted extremely widely. Your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment, and he betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices it to your opinion. In other words, when you elect a representative, you elect him to go off and be brilliant and to make decisions on his own, not to try to represent the opinions of the people from which he sprang. The trustee model implies the same thing that it does when we set up a blind trust, right? That is, we are handing our money over to you.
You do your best to invest it wisely and use my money wisely, but don't check with me about what you do with it, right? We are giving you the authority to make the best decisions you can in the circumstances. In an elected representative democracy such as we are in, the model is quite evident. We elect people who go off as our trustees in our stead to make the wisest decisions possible, but not necessarily, or not even in a positive way, necessarily representing the views of the people from which they come. Counterposed to that is what you've had in Political Science 101 courses, is the so-called delegate model. A delegate is a separate word, and that implies that when we elect somebody, they're really just one of us. The example I gave a moment ago, and we send them off as our delegate simply to do their best to represent our views, and when they come home, we'll send somebody else. We're not necessarily saying that somebody who is a delegate is unusually brilliant, as I alluded to a moment ago. We're not necessarily saying that someone we elect as a delegate has unique insights into how to solve problems. We're simply saying in a complex society, we can't all vote on all issues. So one of us has to go off and help make the collective decision. That's the delegate model that political science has talked about. In my book, I talk about a guy named James Bryce, who's another Englishman, who wrote a lot about the brilliance of the delegate model. George Gallup was a favorite of Frederic Bryce, but Bryce had various stages of democracy, but what he was opining for, he lived in America, by the way, he was an ambassador from England for a while ago. What he was pining for was the fourth stage of democracy. He said when it would be possible for us to ascertain the views of the public at all times. That would be the perfect nirvana, he said, of democracy, when we had representatives, or even didn't have representatives, had a direct democracy so that we could constantly be aware of where the public stood at all times. So we've really got two models there. We have a model of a trustee model which accepts, and perhaps some of you who are experts in the Founding Fathers, Federalist Papers, know a lot more than I do about the thinking that went into our Constitution, but the idea was to have a hybrid government where we send representatives off, but not subject to the whims and passions of the people. These people made decisions on their own as they saw fit, as opposed to a model that says delegates are necessary but not necessarily positive. In a complex society, we can't all vote. We do in Switzerland, maybe, but we can't all vote, so we need to send delegates off, but they should do nothing more than to represent the views of the people and to do at all times exactly as the people back home would want them to do. Two opposing models here that I think best represent the kind of discussion we're having. Now, my point is that even when we adhere to a trustee model, we have to realize that these trustees, these delegates, these representatives have to make decisions on some criteria. So I pulled up this quote in this same article by George W. Bush. He doesn't claim, to his credit, I think, that he is an oracle who goes to the mountaintop and receives, golden tablets from on high to give him a vision about what to do. Totally, right? Bush clearly says, I do have advice, and I do take advice from some people. In this instance, as you can see, the administration. He says they listen, and then they set an example, and then they leave. So our point here is that even the most trustee of trustee model advocates realizes that they have to make a decision on some criteria. In this instance, wise advisors. But they're not saying that it is the people. So representatives clearly say they take the advice of people, but they are reluctant to agree to or admit that they're going to take the advice of the people, as represented by polls. So I'm a trustee delegate, a trustee representative. I'm doing the best. I'm going to get some advice from some sources, but clearly I'm not going to take advice from the people. Seems to be where we are with the current president. Probably Kerry. I haven't been able to get a handle on where Kerry stands, but we haven't heard Kerry talk any about the polls in his campaign. And if Kerry's elected president, I would dare say he probably will echo similar sentiments to George W. Bush about making the best decisions he can. And I doubt he will, what I advocate, set up the whole Office of Polling Administration in the White House to do a lot of investigative and analytic work about polling. Some people say I'm the polling relief advocate. If I had my way, we'd have a lot more need for pollsters in society because a lot more of our elected representatives would need good people on their staff to analyze public opinion. But I doubt Kerry would do that. But at any rate, the current president, a lot of other people are reluctant to admit they make any advantage before. Now, a couple of assumptions here. One, that elite advisors are all-knowing and brilliant. So the president is admitting they need some help, but they're saying, I'm going to elite advisors to give me that help. That's okay. But to the average people to look to advice from them, no! They're dumb, they're uninformed, they're subject to tyrannous whims and passions. Those of you familiar with the Founding Fathers recognize some of those words, and they're too easy manipulated. So a president can begin to edge towards saying, I have to have some advice, but clearly not the advice of the public. A couple of flaws with those arguments that I think are worth looking at. One is, although many advisors are brilliant, by no means do we have a track record that shows that all advisors to elected representatives are brilliant, right? Hillary Clinton, a couple of examples, assembled her dream team of academics and brilliant PhDs in 1993 to design the world's best healthcare plan, if you well remember. In my opinion, although they may have looked at some polling data, what was missing there was the average people, right? I don't think they did a tremendous job of really trying to isolate public opinion about what it is like to wait for 5 hours in an emergency room for primary care, to have to battle an HMO or to deal with paperwork or all the other types of things that are involved. She had the best and the brightest, and they may have had a good solution with the little national health card. In retrospect, maybe people will look back historically and say it was a brilliant plan, but it was before its time, but at least we know politically it laid an egg. This obviously manipulated by the Republican opposition, including Bob Dole, to trounce the plan, but nevertheless it was a plan which probably, to meet a problem which Scott Keeter was saying earlier, and I agree with, is one of the major sleeper issues that we have in America today, which is health care. Maybe had she taken into account more public opinion, more effort to really get the common people involved, we would have had a plan that would have actually been implemented and saved some of the problems that we're facing today with health care, which in our public opinion polls month by month now is rising as a major issue. And it's not people worried that there's no cure for cancer when they get it or their loved ones get it. People are worried about cost of health insurance and availability of health insurance. Those two things, exactly what Hillary Clinton was trying to address. Cost of health insurance, availability of health insurance is what we have significant worries about in society today. But the plan died, as we all know. LBJ, again, I'm no expert in the Vietnam era, but he clearly had a bunch of bright people associated with, Robert McNamara and Dean Rusk and all the other bright Harvards and people. McNamara, CEO or president of Ford Motor Company, Harvard MBA, professors from elite schools and all that, advising him on what to do in Vietnam. Now, maybe Robert Caro, if he were here and he's your next speaker, LBJ's biographer would say it was LBJ's fault. They were giving good advice and they didn't take advantage of it, but I don't think it was all that. These advisors, these brilliant men who were advising LBJ got us into what's now considered probably the most significant foreign policy miscall, miscue, mess problem that we saw in the second half of the 20th century. And I've already talked about Carter's Patrick Goodell, brilliant advisor. He was a pollster, mind you, but I'm talking about the advising part of what Goodell did, which certainly didn't leave him in good stead. Now, the average people, this is a large part of what we could talk about for a large time, but basically I disagree with the arguments. I'm a friend of the little people, and this is probably the core thing that I'm going to show you tonight. You may disagree, but the more I've looked at public opinion data over the years, and the more I've really gotten to know the public, as it were, and by the way, I consider the public to be an entity. I now look at the public as a person. How is the public feeling today? I get up and I look at so much data that I now anthropomorphize the American public and have a feeling for them. I have a lot of respect, a lot of love, a lot of very positive feelings about the wisdom that is gathered together. There's the word again, Fred, the wisdom, rephrase, that can be gathered together by the views and insights of these people, like you in this room, that have to live through life on a day-by-day basis. The criticisms we often hear is that public opinion is remarkably unstable, that it's whimsical and goes up and down from day to day. Not true. Scholarly studies have shown again and again that public opinion is remarkably stable on major issues and doesn't move up and down. The elected representatives are much more likely to, dare I use the word, flip-flop on major issues than the public is themselves when you look at the data. In fact, there is something about amalgamating the views of millions of us together as represented in polls that actually leads to a point, I think, where we have a much more stability in what we're looking at in terms of positions on issues than we do when we just take a small number of people into account. Issue after issue, which we measure at Gallup, we find remarkable little change. Death penalty, abortion, any of these major issues that face us now, there is some linear change. Things will move over time on a gradual basis. If there's a dramatic event, we can see some change. But basically, you don't find 20% of Americans supporting the death penalty for murder. And you do a poll a couple of weeks later and find 80% supporting the support for the death penalty for murder is extraordinarily constant year after year. It will move. It moved up in the 1990s, a higher number, and has come somewhat back down with the emphasis on DNA testing and all that in the late 90s and into the 2000s, but it has not moved dramatically, and remarkably, it's still 60% plus of Americans supporting the death penalty in our basic question. Our second point is the magic that comes from integrating many different diverse opinions together. A lot of people have looked at this. The books have been written recently that say if you put a jar together with a large number of pennies in it, and you have to guess how many pennies in it, what's the best way? To get an expert to come in? No. You get 200 people to come through and guess how many pennies are in the jar. You average it, look at the mean or the arithmetic or the median or the arithmetic mean, and you're going to get a much better estimate there than you would any other way. I don't have the empirical data to justify my Regis Philpin example here, but it certainly seemed to me that the lifeline, when it was the people in the audience who were told, consistently gave the millionaire candidates a lot better advice than when they called the so-called genius who was back home on the phone, remember? And that would certainly be my request. Remember, you could pick any genius you wanted, any friend, any knowledgeable person you wanted at home, you could call. 100 times out of 100, were I to be on that show, I would say, no, give me the lifeline of the average view of 100 people sitting in the audience. And not always, but very, very consistently, they came up with the right answer. There's more to it. The part that I bolded and italicized there is a lot of discussion that can be based on it, but it is my conviction, a core conviction, that when you take the plumber and the housewife and the doctor and the farm worker and the lawyer and the college professor and the college student who's above 18 years of age and the guy who's on welfare and the millionaire and the immigrant who just became a citizen a few years ago and the blue blood New Englander who's been here for 4 generations and somebody who served in World War II, somebody who served in Vietnam, somebody whose child is in Iraq, somebody who's never had any contact with the military, you put all of these people together and amalgamate their opinions together. What comes out of that is a distilled essence that has a tremendous value to us as we try to make broad-based decisions about the direction of American society. We're not talking about asking Americans to make a decision on which submarine system to fund. Very specific decisions about whether or not we pull our ambassador out of Chad because of some diplomatic incident. Obviously, we need experts. Obviously, there's a lot of specifics that we have bureaucracies to deal with, and elected representatives who have to make decisions on the spot without recourse to public opinion. But for a lot of our broad decisions, a lot of the decisions that we need to make as a society for advancing it forward, it is this wisdom that distills out of the people that I think is remarkable and that we need to take more advantage of rather than less. And finally, of course, on this, we talk about the public being manipulated. I told you how stable it is. Look what's manipulating our elected representatives, right? Special interests, lobbyists, campaign contributors and what have you. Now, I'm not always sure that it's a good choice to say let these elected representatives who are subject to those pressures as opposed to the amalgamated distilled views of all of Americans on the other side. And of course, there came the methods. This is, of course, my view that when you're analyzing public opinion, you use science. The scientists, social scientists by choice. I like the scientific method. I like public opinion. I think we apply science to measure public opinion. Public opinion polling is the scientific effort to measure the attitudes and opinions of the American public systematically. And that's why I'm saying when officials, even as a small paradox here, seem to want to measure constituent opinion to some crude ways by emails and all that, why not use science? And science, of course, is the best available scientific method to use to measure this collective wisdom. People object. People may jump to their feet and say, miraculous method, throw the man out, right? We hate polling. But my view is that polling, the more you look at it, scientific public opinion, well analyzed, and I think Fred had a good point when we were talking earlier, it's not the data, it is the analysis of the data, very similar to how medical scientists analyze the preponderance of literature about a proposed cure for cancer. When you analyze the literature on a given area, the public opinion on a given area, you really do have a miraculous way to provide counsel and input to those that we elect to make decisions on our part. Now, there are problems. Sampling is the biggest issue, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we get more comments about sampling problems than we do with any other critique of what I just told you. I didn't realize all these were going to fly in. So. How's that? Okay. The process, I won't go into in great detail. We talked about it this afternoon, and most of you are familiar with it, but if done correctly, Using the telephone kind of sampling that we're talking about here, we really do have a miraculous way to actually find scientifically the public opinion of Americans at this point. We use phone sampling today. Most public opinion pollers do. There's controversy in that method. There are people that use internet sampling. We use phone sampling. We think it works well. Questions could be manipulated. A second objection that we often hear to public opinion polling. That's true. I think I said that on the NPR article this morning, that indeed questions can make a difference. The way you ask questions can make a difference. Look at one example here. Should we fund, look at version 1 about taxes. Should we fund, use the money instead of what to do with the rest? Should you use it to fund blah, 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 or use it to cut taxes? Notice the difference in the two versions. Look on the right-hand side. The question was simply, should we use the excess money, and boy, these were the good old days when we had excess money, to cut taxes or to increase government spending? Or on the left-hand side, we said, do we use it to fund the retirement savings accounts and so forth? Look at the big difference. When you specify the specific account, you got a significant percent of Americans who said use it to those. If you just said, quote, government spending, you had a big percent who simply said use it to cut taxes. Now, is this bad? Does this mean that polling is terrible? No, I think we have learned something, and that's my central core point about public opinion polling. From this example, we have learned something about public opinion. We have found that, in general, there is a negative view about government spending, and we find that across a lot of our data and literature. People think government is too big, does things in general that they don't like, but when there are very specific programs that are enunciated, the public all of a sudden says, yes, if you're going to listen to specific programs for me, in fact, there are better uses for money than actually giving them back to me to cut taxes. So we have found that there is a variation in public opinion here, a negative view on government in general, but a very positive view when you can actually enunciate ways that it would come back to help the public themselves, and that's, of course, in that other question. By the way, we've never found strong support for Bush's tax cuts, centerpiece of his administration. In all of our polling, the public says, we're not that interested in getting $400 back. We would rather spend it than we go to that. Final point about polling is the critique that we often hear is that there are many different results. We had that this morning. There are too many different conflicting reports of poll results. How do we make sense out of it? Scott and I were talking today. We had examples last week on horse race polling where you're going to have more conflict than elsewhere. But nevertheless, in a lot of our polling, we find one poll will say X and one poll will say Y. Many elected representatives, when asked why they don't use polling more often, actually come back and say one of the reasons is that they get conflicting poll results. Lobbyist A comes in and says the public thinks this. Lobbyist B comes in and says that. They say, how can I make sense out of it? I'm not going to pay attention. Well, polling has a special operating procedure that really makes this more difficult than usual. There are no barriers to entry, so to speak, for people to put out polling results. If you're going to do medical research, A, it's more difficult to do medical research than polling, hardcore medical research. And B, if you're going to publish it generally, it has to go through a refereed publishing process. New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of the American Medical Association. If I want to do my own poll as John Jones Polling Incorporated, it's fairly easy to do polling nowadays. Fairly cheap, actually, because one can buy samples and one can get even robots to do the calling for someone. So that it's a recorded voice on the phone, which is fairly cheap to do. And then one can say, I have a poll that shows X% of Americans say that we should pass an amendment making marriage only between a man and a woman. And I send it out to the media, and a lot of the media will actually publish it. There's no vetting of this. There's no referee process. Like medical research, most people wouldn't accept or even publish somebody who just sends in a report saying eating apricot pits cures cancer. They would say, well, send it to the New England Journal of Medicine, and then if it seems to pass the review process, okay. In polling, we have none of that, so we have a real problem in polling. We have media imperatives, where polling results need to be put out there with speed, they need to be easy to digest, and they need to have extremely short formats. The kind of work I do on CNN, if you've seen it, we have our own studio set up in Princeton. That was in part to allow us to talk about polling in more depth than just when an anchor simply says a new poll shows 45% of Americans reject Bush's tax cuts. But even then, what am I given? What's the time I'm given? A minute and a half. If I have 2.5 minutes, that's considered to be an eternity in television to try to explain what's going on with polling results. Even now, we're on our own website doing Gallup Daily Briefing, where I do a video on our own website. You go to gallup.com, but you'll find the same thing. The producers that we have working with us said, Frank, keep it to 3 minutes. You know, that's the most we can do. When we all realize that to really try to understand public opinion in these issues takes a lot more time than that. So obviously the need here is more time and space. 8 was what George Gallup did. He used to buy a syndicated thing, and he would have an entire page that he would syndicate, and newspapers would simply put a whole page to explain his poll results in, which would be great. I've had a column with the King Syndicate for many years, but they're saying there's such a scrunch now on newshole space in newspapers that there's no longer as much interest in a column about polling because they have, they barely have space to put anything in there. They say, why don't you consider giving us a graphic column from Gallup, where you have a graph and 2 sentences below it, like in the lower left-hand corner of USA Today. That's what they want to do now, and no room to actually explain polling. Or maybe it's my own writing style, I'm not sure, but that's what they're telling me. We need better polling-trained journalists, clearly. A lot of people have no idea what they're doing. Reporters, well-intentioned reporters, particularly at smaller market papers and television stations trying to report. We need time for more detailed analysis, more poll integration, multiple. All of these are things that I think we could do to help make polling more viable in the future, to kind of hit what I think is my ultimate vision, which is kind of where we start with this, that polls can and should be a positive, fundamentally important element of a well-functioning democratic society. The last sentence in that book, I thought of what Dr. George Gallup called public opinion as the pulse of democracy, and hence polls, the pulse of democracy, many years ago when he wrote a book by that title back in 1940. I think there's a lot of wisdom to that, obviously, from what I've been saying today. There are hurdles, there are problems, working with the media and pollsters, but if it can be done right, if polling can be analyzed, carefully and scientifically brought together in the same way that medical research and other scientific endeavors do it, I think we have a really, really positive mechanism to use as part of the decision-making process as we move our society forward in the days and the months and the years to come. Now, with that said, I think it's worth getting specific for just a second, and we'll open it up for questions if we can. All right, a quick look at elections. We have determined beyond a shadow of a doubt at Gallup, having looked at it carefully, that Michael Budnarek, who is the Libertarian Party candidate, is going to win this election. In fact, this is the first time I've discussed this publicly, but our data show he's a real sleeper candidate. Actually, we hear from Michael Budnarek. Some of you may be Libertarian, so I'm not making fun of him, but we don't include him typically in our poll list, where he's going to vote for Bush or Kerry or Nader. And we are besieged by emails from his people saying, why not? You know, the same people that besieged the debate commission saying, we want him up on stage with Kerry and Bush. Well, actually, I was kidding. I don't think Budnarek has a great chance of winning. And I'll be frank with you at this point, and even if this is publicly disseminated, I don't think Nader has a great chance of winning the election this year. However, as I was saying to some people a little earlier tonight, I do believe that it is still quite possible that either Bush or Gore, excuse me, I'm still living in 2000, either Bush or John Kerry could win this election. I said this a few days ago when I was interviewed. Only a fool, even at this point, would try to predict who the winner of this election is going to be. Now, in our opinion, at Gallup, Bush is ahead for a variety of reasons, and I'll show you some of these as we go through. But the more we look at our historic trend of data between Labor Day and Election Day, the more we see how significantly races could be altered. Gore was ahead at some points in the fall of 2000. Bush was ahead. The race ended up the popular vote at 48-48. Gore had a few more votes, but it was statistically tied. Jimmy Carter was ahead of Ronald Reagan after Labor Day in 1980 by 4 points in the Gallup poll. Reagan won the popular vote by 10 points. There was a 14-point swing in the gap in that race. Nixon was comfortably ahead of Hubert Humphrey after Labor Day back in 1968. By the time the race was over, the popular vote was extremely close, that close. Jimmy Carter was sailing to a defeat of Gerald Ford back in 1976 in our Labor Day poll, ahead by 9 points. Now, by the time the dust cleared on the election in 1976, Carter still won, but it was only by 2 points. Carter had closed the gap to 2 points. Even in 1992, we were here. Clinton, in some of our polling earlier in 1992, after Perot ceased to be as much of a factor, was ahead well into double digits of George Bush. Clinton did win, but the final popular vote, you may not remember, was 5 points, 43-38. Clinton only won by about 5 points, so that race closed as well. In fact, the more we look at the data, the more we realize that there is a more probabilistic tendency over the last 17 elections for elections to close rather than expand in the remaining time between Labor Day and Election Day. Bush is ahead now, in our opinion, in Gallup, based on our data, that the probabilities are higher that it's going to close than it is to expand at this point. And we talked earlier about the great unknown, and that's the debates. One one reason Bush tried to weasel out of doing it, one of the debates was incumbents usually have more to lose in a debate situation, particularly incumbents who've been ahead in the polls. The challengers have more to gain, and so there's certainly the chance that Kerry can do something in the debates that's going to significantly alter the race. Although we remember in 1984, there were some doubts about Ronald Reagan's age. In one debate, remember, when he looked at Bernard Shaw, late at CNN, turned to Reagan, he was running against Walter Mondale of Minnesota, you remember, and said, do you think age should be an issue in this debate, Mr. Reagan, President Reagan? He said, no. In his Reagan-esque way, I wish I could do the mimicking of Ronald Reagan. He said, I pondered this issue, but I do not think that the relative age, young age and inexperience of my opponent should be a major issue in this election. Of course, the whole audience shrieked with laughter, and he had, in his acting way, had simply turned it around. And although I think Reagan was going to win anyhow, he was comfortably ahead of Mondale the whole way. That kind of put the nail in the coffin as far as Mondale was concerned. Debates can be significant, is what I'm saying. But let's look at where we stand now. Keys to the election. Where did the showdown states stand? If we learned one thing back in 2000, it's not pay a lot of attention to the popular vote necessarily. Virginia's not one yet. I won't mention names, but I certainly talked to Bush supporters and Kerry supporters earlier today here at Richmond. Some Kerry supporters were eagerly at work, they were telling me, to try to make Virginia a showdown state once again. In other words, Kerry to come within the point where he was challenging Bush. We haven't seen it yet. We'll keep watching. Right track, wrong track. I'll talk about it briefly. Is the country on the right track or the wrong track? A key indicator for Bush. Bush's approval. What's the most important problem? I'll talk about that. The economy, Iraq, terrorism, social and policy issues, and finally, the latter issue is probably what I think may be the most important issue of all of this election, and that is the image of Kerry, because he's less well known than Bush, and how he's finally defined on the part of the American public. Just briefly to look at a couple of things to give us a little clue to this. What's the top Republican state? All by way of saying this is why none of these states are showdown states. We did a big compilation of party ID by state. Virginia's not even in the list of top Republican states. These are the really Republican states here. Not a single one of these has been commented on by anybody this year to be a battleground swing state. If these states don't vote for Bush, then the election is over. Kerry's won. Same way here, the top 10 Democratic states. Not a single one of these, at least so far, has anybody said is going to be in any way possibly a Bush state. Notice New Jersey's not on here. New Jersey's been considered to be a safe Kerry state. The most recent Quinnipiac poll, brief moment in time, showed a tie in New Jersey, so all of a sudden it may be. But these are the states that obviously, just by way of reference, aren't going to be in contention. Right now, it's the white states that matter. These are the states, a crude way of looking at it, pretty good way of looking at it. These are the states that were within 5 points of one another in 2000. White states. Virginia's a red state, isn't it? That's why you don't matter. The poor people here who are working for Bush or Kerry, forget it. Virginia's simply, unless the race gets close, is not going to make probably a huge difference. Our latest polling shows more movement to Bush than Gore in these states. Ohio, our poll showed him ahead 6 to 8 points. The University of Cincinnati poll just came out of there to go 11 points for Bush in Ohio, which is the key swingest of swing states. Missouri, we show him ahead. Kerry's pulled his money out of Missouri. Our most recent polling in Iowa and another poll showed Bush up by 6, not insurmountable. He's doing better Bush is doing better in Wisconsin. Some controversy about polls in Minnesota. The Star Tribune poll showed Kerry ahead. Traditionally a Democratic state. A couple of polls, including ours, showed it too close to call, Bush gaining there. Michigan, Kerry still has a lead, our poll and others. Pennsylvania, tied. Every poll I've seen so far shows Pennsylvania tied. Nevada, just releasing a poll today. We just finished showing Nevada now moving into the Bush column. Washington, by the way, stayed in the upper left, still in the Kerry column. If you look at a lot of these states, at least the current tendencies are more towards Bush, particularly some of these states like Iowa that barely went to Gore back in 2000, than towards Kerry. So when you look at the map, the electoral map at this point, based on this moment in time, you get more of a tendency to Bush than you do to Kerry. Now, how satisfied are you with the way things are going? In fact, look at the circles. This is since Bush took office. Green is good. Green means Americans are satisfied. The brown means they're not. 3 peaks for satisfaction. 3 peaks for satisfaction. The classic rally effect. People ask me, how come satisfaction jumped after 9/11? 3,000 people killed in an enemy attack on American soil. Rally effect. When something like that happens, political scientists, sociologists, public opinion scientists, and others are rallying, coming together of public opinion behind the leader. And also, like people express, we have external threat, the sociologists used to tell us, leads to internal solidarity. That's why they invented witches in the Puritan days, because it made people come together to have external enemies, right? Well, having an enemy means you come together and look at the high numbers there. What's the second point at which we saw the dramatic peak in satisfaction? As the Iraq War began in March of 2003, although that dissipated. And the third came when Saddam Hussein, in the days after Saddam Hussein was captured last December. So the three times that satisfaction has really moved above the 50% point since Bush took office, and then there have been dramatic events on foreign shores. A brilliant student here at Richmond earlier today asked, is it possible, and what impact would it have if Osama bin Laden is found, right? And without saying anything else, I'll just say, look at what we've seen in peaks when something major has happened on foreign shores. Second, let's give Karl Rove of the Bush administration credit for being a brilliant thinker. And we'll go to the next slide. Okay? Satisfaction and approval ratings. This is a fascinating chart. Look at this. These are incumbent job approval ratings for two who won and two who lost, and we juxtapose Bush right into the middle of them. Those bottom lines are Bush the Elder and Jimmy Carter. Job approval ratings at this point in September of their election year down in the 30% range. Now, those who lost were well above 50%. In fact, Reagan was at like 57 and Clinton was at 60 at this point in September of their election years. Bush's current job approval rating, 52% in our latest rating in Gallup, which is not quite at the level of Reagan and Clinton, the last two incumbents who won, but clearly it's above 50%. And clearly, if you measure the distance, you can see that Bush's current job approval is closer to the winners than the losers at this point. So based on this analysis at this point, given an incumbent's job approval rating, a critical edge, we have to give the edge to Bush at this point. There has not been, the Bush people are glad to point out, but it's true, there's not been an incumbent who's been reelected in modern day times since we've had polling who has not been reelected who had a job approval rating above 50%. There is a first time for everything, but nevertheless, this chart suggests at the moment Bush is moving closer to the winners than the losers. Most important problem facing the country, war in Iraq by itself is the number one problem. This is, to date, mixed. I'll show you that in a moment for Bush, because Americans are not defining that as a major problem yet. Kerry's trying to get them to define it as a major negative. But notice the economy and domestic concerns are major issues. If you add them up, you'll see there's significant concern over domestic issues and most important problem. Our general reading is the higher the concern about the economy, the worse the incumbent's chances. And the economy is still a real mixed bag. So we give Bush just mixed marks on the economy. He's not as bad off as Carter and his father, but he's certainly not doing great as far as the economy is concerned. This is the percent who rated excellent or good. Those high points, you can't read it, come in 2000, back in the boom days, the dot-com days. Notice how far it came down at one point to only 18% rating the economy excellent or good. Our most recent reading from last week, 39%. Not great by any means, but nevertheless certainly not as bad as it's been. So Bush is in a gray zone in the middle when it comes to how the economy is doing. It's now a great time to find a quality job. Only 30% of Americans say yes, green is good, orange is bad in this one, therefore this is not great for Bush either. You've got a significant majority of Americans say it's not a good time to be looking for a job. Still, when you net out the excellent, good, minus poor economic ratings, notice where his father was through 1992, and you'll see what a bad economy really looks like. In August and September of 1992, the net between excellent or good minus poor ratings of the economy for Bush the Elder were minus 43 and minus 40. You had a majority of Americans saying the economy was in poor shape. And at this point, if nothing else, Bush is netting out in positive territory. More people say excellent or good than poor. So although the economy now is not in great shape by any means, particularly relative to the dot-com boom days, it's certainly better than the last president who was defeated for re-election. That was Bush. And if you want to see how a negative economy can impact an incumbent, look at those bottom numbers. Iraq. There are different ways to measure Iraq. This is probably symptomatic of a summary of the literature on Iraq at this point. It's divided the nation. 49-48, this was as of about a week and a half ago, September 3 to 5. Different questions, and that's why I was talking about earlier, need to be analyzed in context to get a true picture of Iraq. If you want one simple kind of ballot measure on it, this is the question we've asked many, many times now, and it basically shows the country is divided. And by the way, this is Bush's war. If I had time to take you that 49% have said yes and looked at who those people are. They're dominantly Republican. If we looked at the red bar, those who are against it, they're dominantly Democrats, and there's no question that this is a war which is extraordinarily partisan at this point. But it's not a winner for Bush in the sense that he's got the kind of support he had at the time we went to war against Iraq, 70% plus. It's not a winner for Kerry because we don't have a majority, a significant majority, who are saying at this point that it was not worth it. Here's the key. The next two slides are the real key for Bush's lead at this point, in our opinion, at Gallup. What's most important in your vote, issues or leadership? 2000, it was issues. Now, 50 to 38, Americans have tilted to saying it's leadership that we want at this point, a strong vision for the country. Bush, typically in our poll, Pew poll and other polls, is scoring 20% plus higher than Bush when we ask who is the stronger leader, who's the most decisive leader. Whether this to some degree reflects what the Bush campaign wants people to reflect, that's politics, but nevertheless it is reality at this point that this is the key to Bush's strength at this point, is his image that he's a leader in Kerry as well. John Kerry's image has been deteriorating to some degree since the attacks began. It doesn't look as dramatic as it may seem, but it's closed up to now. He's still more positive than negative, but it's only a 7% margin. At some point earlier this year, it was much closer to a 20-point positive to negative margin. Bush's image, a little more positive, has stayed relatively steady through all the attacks and has now actually increased. So, negatives going up on Kerry. Most polls show that people have bought into the flip-flopping argument. Leadership, Bush wins by 20-plus points, a real key, we think, to the election. Here's where we are at this point. It's been close. Our last Gallup poll among likely voters, which created a vast flurry of emails from Democrats and discussion. In fact, we were talking about the Wall Street Journal had a nice article on Monday discussing why this poll would show a larger margin than other polls showed at the time. Although the New York Times CBS poll had 8 or 9 point lead among registered voters in their poll that was released on Saturday. The Pew poll, of which Dr. Keeter's here to talk about, had showed Bush had by double-digit leads early last week, I think, and then later in the week suddenly showed Kerry catching up. So there's some controversy now about what's happening in the polls. But it's my interpretation that we'll probably see a closing of this gap, clearly. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of reasons why we think Kerry's been catching up. But nevertheless, the trends are clear. Even if this is an abnormally positive reading for Bush at this time, the trends are clear. Bush has been doing better in state polling, at least our national polling and some other national polling, than Kerry at this time. And again, Bush is moving more up with that kind of margin. These are the people who won. All of these races, the winner is on top, the incumbent's on top, always above 50%. Incumbent always had a higher vote. Bush has been below that range, but he's beginning to come up into that same positive net territory. That is, he's beating his opponent just like all the winners did. Notice how much LBJ was beating Goldwater, and that actually settled near the end, as you can see there. And Bush has been pulling away from the losers. These are the people who lost. Ford lost to Carter, Carter the incumbent lost to Reagan, Bush the incumbent lost to Clinton. All of those races, the losers, incumbents, were below water, that is, their opponents were leading in most of the polling throughout the year, including right now. The fact that Bush has now come back up again significantly suggests that he's moving a little more into the territory of the winners at this point. So again, the final keys to this election on the economy, it's mixed. It's neither the best of worlds or the worst of worlds, as some famous author might say. The economy for Bush is mixed. It's not terrible. It's not great. Issues and policies, Bush has a plus on values. I didn't get into that. He's conservative. Americans are conservative. Iraq is a total situation now that could go either way, in our opinion, Gallup. So far, it's okay for Bush. Not a winner, not a loser. Kerry's trying to make it a loser for Bush. Whether he succeeds or not is one of the real keys to the election. Mood and satisfaction is lower, below 50%, but Clinton won with below 50%, 96, so that's not a deal killer. Job approval is looking better for Bush. It's above 50% at this point. Kerry's image is suffering at this point. Whether he can resurrect it is another key, and all that leads to the election battle. In our opinion, it's the bottom two probably which are going to be the most critical in this election. That is Iraq in particular, Roman number 2, and Kerry's image, number 5. Those are the two key issues that are going to the campaign make. Barring terrorist attacks or dramatic changes in the economy that are really going to make the difference in this election, and we'll see how those play. Kerry has a chance to make Iraq an issue. His new advisors from Clinton's era are telling him, make Iraq your total story. We'll see if that catches on. He has a chance in 3 debates now to make his image look much better than it has to date. We'll see how well that works. All of that, we think, will lead to the final ballot. All right, with that in mind, we as Greenfield, my good friend, said, need to leave some room for questions here, or comments. Barring partisan comments, perhaps, people who want to get up and tell us why they think Kerry should be winning, I think it may be important to discuss some of our polling activity. All right, questions or comments?
What do you think of Bill Schneider, the poll man?
I'm sorry, what?
What do you think of Bill Schneider, the poll man?
What do I think of Bill Schneider, the poll man? I've never been asked that question. Bill Schneider is CNN's senior political analyst, those of you who don't know him. Those of you who are political scientists know William Schneider. He worked with Seymour Martin Woodson, PhD, taught at Boston University. He's a very smart political scientist. He's been through many election cycles. He's got a great staff with him, so I have utmost respect for Bill Schneider. How's that for an answer? If you're listening, Bill, I'll get the payback later. Actually, I'm going to tape an interview with Bill tomorrow morning at 11. And we're going to do something on polling. We'll be able to see it in the wire at 3 if you want to tune in and see Bill and me together. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you. First of all, thank you for a very interesting lecture and for coming.
Thank you.
Second, thank you very much for deigning to mention the Libertarian Party and its candidate, Michael Badnarik. I think it's the first time that the Gallup organization has done so. Certainly the first time that I've heard of it. Why is it that the polling organizations cannot bring themselves to mention the alternatives to the Republicans and the Democrats, bearing in mind that that is the reason, or at least the reason given, for denying any mention of them or any inclusion in the debates is because, well, the polls don't give them much power.
Let me answer
that's not given as a choice, sir.
Yeah.
Since that is not given as a choice, how can one possibly overcome that barrier?
It's a serious question. I started out joking about the Libertarian and third-party candidates, and we do hear a lot from them. If you're one of the Libertarians, you're well organized because we get enormous numbers of emails. It is serious, and we do take it quite seriously. We do make the decision that we cannot include in our polls when we read a list of for whom you're going to vote every third-party candidate, because in many states there are 30 or more on the ballot. So we have a variety of procedures that we do, and in fact, in our last poll, we included the Libertarian candidate and the Constitution and all that to see what, and he got less than, or rounded up to 1% of the vote. We also asked name ID, and he's an unknown factor to over 80% of the population. We also ask an open-ended question every election, who are you going to vote for without mentioning names. And we also allow any respondent, even when we only mention Kerry or Bush or Nader, to volunteer any response they want, and we write that and put it down. So there are many opportunities for Libertarian or Constitution Party supporters to mention their candidates. So we do take our obligation quite seriously, but it is a trade-off. We simply cannot list all the names and take the time on the phone to list candidates who have no realistic chance, as of our current data, empirically, of being a major factor in the election. That's why we don't read the names. But that's why in this last poll, just to get into this little inside baseball, we included the Libertarian candidate's name to see if we were missing something. To see if, in fact, when we read his name, we would found this tidal wave of support that we were missing, and we didn't. We got enough people to barely round up to 1%. So we take it quite seriously. The debate commission is another factor. You'll have to talk to them. They're sued every year by third-party candidates who say they should have like 10 people on the stage. They've made the decision that that's not doing a service to the American public because the major two candidates would be washed out. The Democratic people, a lot of people said Al Sharpton and some of the others, although extraordinarily creative individuals and actually added a lot of life to the debates, may have taken the focus away from the candidates who people wanted to hear more about. And that's what the debate commission has decided. But that's an argument to have to take up with them.
Yeah, I just have a question about, prior to the partisan convention this year, there was a lot of question about what the balance would be coming out of first the Democratic convention and then the Republican convention. We saw out of the Democratic convention that there was not a lot of balance, and the discussion was America is becoming more partisan over time, and therefore no balance can be expected. Then the Republican convention came, and we saw somewhat of a balance, and so some people dismissed that, some people hung on to that. My question is your comment on, is that happening? Is America going further and further divided and less in the swing, an uncommitted voter section? And if that's the case, what does that do in terms of people's ability to use polling?
Good question. Yes, most of the data suggests, and I won't get into all, that Americans are more polarized. We talked about this afternoon. There are a variety of empirical indicators that say Americans are more hardcore in support for one of the other sides than they have been in the past. There are a lot of good reasons for it, a lot of discussions. There was less bounce on both sides than historically. Historically, in Gallup polling after conventions, the candidate whose convention is can gain 5 points or more. Kerry gained no points, and Bush probably gained a couple of points. He's actually increased his support before his convention, and he's increased his support after his convention as much as he did, 2 weeks after, as much as directly after. So even Bush's bounce was quite minimal. Kerry had none at all. So this summer, it goes down in history as the bounceless summer in general, although Bush did a little better than Kerry. Part of that, one reasonable explanation for it is the polarization. One reason conventions lead to bounces in the past is because that's the first time that voters kind of tune in and say, oh, look at this guy, Bill Clinton. Clinton got a huge bounce in '92, maybe because people, oh, look at this guy, Clinton, he's interesting. First time I've seen him. Based on all our data by the time the conventions rolled around this summer, Americans were extraordinarily more already into the campaign, and therefore there was nothing new they were going to learn about Kerry or Bush and less of a bounce. It doesn't really affect our polarization. As far as we measure, it doesn't really affect what we're doing, whether Americans are highly volatile or not.
When you look at the chart of the peaks of Bush's popularity, is it a fair assumption that we have a reasonable assumption that if we have another terrorist attack, that would probably be another peak in Bush's popularity?
Yeah, I'm asked that a lot. There is, as I mentioned, I didn't show you the chart of his, job approval all through his administration, but it would look similar to the one I did show you, which was satisfactory the way things were going. Yes, there's a classic rally effect when America is challenged internationally. Even when the Mayaguez was boarded in the Ford administration, the hostages initially taken in the Jimmy Carter administration, the job approval goes up at least temporarily. It certainly did after 9/11, to the all-time record high for George W. Bush. People ask me that, but my opinion is that yes, in the short term, if there was another terrorist attack, Bush's job approval rating would go up, not down. Yes.
Sorry. Zogby, I pay a lot of attention to the Zogby poll, and with the latest jumps in the numbers, a lot of polls ship it up. Showed Bush with a double-digit lead, and Zogby, to my knowledge, was the only ones who showed, I think it was either a 3 or 4 point. And one of the explanations was there's different wings given to Republicans, Democrats, and independents. So can you speak just a little bit to kind of, is it a statistical anomaly, or is it just how you weigh the different groups and the demographics that you are gathering data from?
Good question. There are some of both of the above. There are differences, which we don't have time to go into here, in the way research firms handle various aspects of the research process. People say, well, isn't that bad? Well, I say, if you go in for coronary bypass surgery, there are different ways the surgeons perform the surgery. So different well-meaning people, now I'm not necessarily including Zogby in that, but different well-meaning pollsters will actually conduct polling with different assumptions, and therefore that can come out with different results. And it's up to us as scientists to say, is one better than the other, and to put them together and try to analyze what they all tell us. But well-meaning, well-intentioned, extremely smart people can make different decisions. There have been differences. It wasn't just Zogby, there were some other polls that showed it. As I mentioned, the Pew Research poll, the second half of a longer poll they did showed a very close race, so there were some that did show it close. Not Pew, which doesn't weight by party, but Zogby does a variety of weird things with his data. The researchers aren't exactly sure what he does, but one of the things he does do is he creates what he thinks should be the percentage of Republicans, Independents, and Democrats in his sampling controls for it. We don't at Gallup. It's a complicated argument, but we do not believe that's an appropriate research procedure. We don't do it. That may be part of the explanation for some differences.
Question, are you using landline phones when you're conducting your polls? And if so, do you think you're leaving out a big segment of the population that now relies mostly on cell phones?
We are extremely conscious as a research industry of the implications of changing technology. So we're monitoring that carefully. We have conferences on it. It's an urban myth that huge numbers are cell phone only. The last statistic that our research statisticians gave us was 3%, maybe at most 5% of households are cell phone only. So we're not missing a huge component of the population. Our research is landline only for the most part. Cell phones to date, present problems because people don't want to conduct an interview and they're paying for the minutes when they get the call. But we are conscious of the fact, particularly with young people, because there's been a lot of discussion and focus on our pollsters missing young people this year who may be moving into the electorate in new ways. We are sensitive to and conscious of this issue that technology may make it more difficult for us to do our job right, so we're trying to correct and look at that at all times. But to date, we do not believe that a lot of technological changes like caller ID and call waiting and cell phone only households have created a major problem for us in terms of bias in our results. But we are extremely sensitive to that issue because it's the core of what we do and we're constantly monitoring. But it's a good question. We're asked it very often. People assume that, well, polling must be bad now because there is a lot of technology that's changed. And to date, we don't see it.
Issue today that ought to be a big campaign debate is the Supreme Court.
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
One of the issues I don't hear anything about is the Supreme Court. I'm surprised that's not more of an issue than it is. Can you tell me why nobody wants to touch that? I didn't see it mentioned in your different degrees of issues and so forth.
It has not been a major issue in the campaign, and I can't answer that question. I know that liberal Democratic groups supporting John Kerry in literature have certainly made one of their issues that if Bush is reelected, he may, Scott, what's the number? 4 Supreme Court justices, 3, I mean, you know, they're getting so old that there's a chance that the next president may be able to appoint a number of Supreme, and of course, more liberally oriented people, particularly on issues like Roe versus Wade, point out that a conservative president might appoint more conservative justices and tip it either way. So it's certainly been there in a lot of the discussion, but you're right, I don't see it out there in the major discussions at all. It's not a major issue that's talked about. We would poll about it more if it came up more, but to date it's not been a major issue. And our most important problem, you know, there's no discussion.
Yeah, I was just wondering, have you done any polling on the whole Dan Rather Memogate subject?
He's a great, I'm from Texas. Dan Rather's from Texas, so he's a great guy. Next question. Now, there's been some polling, we haven't done a lot, but what we did do last week, we were in the field with the poll about media credibility, and it's already terrible. You know, the percent of Americans, a majority of Americans say they have very little or no trust or confidence in the media to report the news accurately. And that was before Dan Rather. But there have been a lot of, I mean, you're Jason Blair, you've got years and years of media problems. So in my opinion, the Dan Rather docu-gate, memo-gate, whatever it's being called, is simply adding fuel to the fire. It's more convincing of Americans that the media, particularly because we do know in our data that many more Americans think the media are too liberal than think they're conservative. And since Dan Rather is generally considered to be more liberal and the major mainstream networks are more liberal, this will just add fuel to the conservative fire that the media are too liberal. By the way, there's a major distinction between national. When we say media, we think, most people think national. So if you ask, you like the Richmond, whatever your paper is here, or Channel 6 News or whatever it is, you get much higher ratings for local media. Actually, Scott Keeter here works for the Pew Center. One of their it's the Center for the People in the Press. So one of the major things they do, Scott does right here, is to analyze people's attitudes towards the press. So you've got one of the world's experts on attitudes towards the media here. So after the session, you might want to grab Scott and get his expert opinion on it. Because they track attitudes to the media for a living at the Pew Center for People in the Press.
For the last couple of decades, there's been evidence that women are more likely to vote for Democrats and men more likely to vote for Republicans. Yesterday, there was a report by Cokie Roberts, who was looking at opinion data suggesting that women are now evenly divided. Do your data support that view? And if they do you have any reason as to why that, do you have any explanation as to why that is?
Yeah, there are 100 explanations, but in our data and others, we have shown some change in the gender gap. There's still a gender gap, by the way. Men are still more likely to vote for Bush vis-a-vis Kerry than are women. But in our last poll, for example, although men were more Bush, women were dead even in terms of voting for Kerry versus Bush. So there has been a change, depending on which poll you look at. You have to be a little careful because you have to look at the relative gaps in their changes. But there seemingly, particularly into the summer months after earlier this year, has been a change. So that women are less likely to be as strongly Democratic vis-a-vis males at the same period of time as they have been in the past. It's a significant change. A lot of people are trying to come up with reasons as to why that's the case. Some people say it's because Bush has appealed to security interests, soccer moms. We don't, in one of our recent questions, we said, why are you voting for Bush? The Bush voters and women were much more likely to talk about his morality and religion, not security. So I'm not sure that's an explanation. There are as many answers and opinions about that as there are pundits who think about it, but I don't have a definitive answer to why, at least in the short term, Kerry's not doing as well vis-a-vis as well among women as Democratic candidates have in the past. It's a good question. It's a major factor because, as I think many people have pointed out, Clinton would have lost his elections had men been only the ones voting. You know, Clinton won because women gave him the vote. And that's been true all year. Men are voting for Bush, much more so than women. So if the women begin to move also, relatively speaking, disproportionately more for Bush over Kerry, it's a major loss for Kerry. Yes.
Are your polls showing any indication about voter turnout?
Got to be higher. Most of us who study this for a living are seeing all of our indicators higher than it has been in the past. We've already adjusted our turnout internal indicators up higher. And there's every indication in our data, unless it just levels off, that it is going to be higher. We have significantly higher levels of interest earlier in this election than we have in previous elections. That would be our best guess. Although people talk about higher turnout in a lot of previous elections, and there seems to be a regression to the mean at the last minute, it never materializes as much as people think it is. So we'll see what happens. But if you have to put me on the spot now, I would say the probabilities are much higher that we'll have higher turnout, say, than 2000, than that we would have the same or lower.
What is your opinion as to how much polls influence public opinion and eventual voting?
The question was, do polls influence public opinion and eventual voting? It's hard to pin down. There have been research studies trying to look at it. George Gallup used to talk about the bandwagon effect, which was if you showed candidate X ahead, then more and more people say, I want to be with the winner, and and then gradually that winner would increase. Of course, mathematically, if there's a real bandwagon effect, every candidate would win by 100%. To say my vote, because more and more people, and we don't find that. We find surges who come from behind at the last minute. Kerry likes to talk about now the fact that he was written off totally as low in the polls in the Democratic primary season. Yet he came from behind, so obviously being behind in the polls didn't keep Kerry from winning the Democratic nomination. And there are 100 examples like that. So it's clear that you can be behind in the polls and win an election, that you're not doomed because you're behind in publicly released polls. My second point is that I don't think it's bad at all if polls do influence public opinion. If a rational voter, one of you out here, wants to take polling into account and making a decision, more power to you. We need more information rather than less in society, and that's as reasonable a criteria to take into account in voting as the 30-second attack ad that, influences people. Now, I had in my book, I kind of thought it was good in California when polls showed Schwarzenegger was leading in the polls for the recall election if Gray Davis was recalled. Why? Because it let California voters know ahead of time that they were about to elect a movie actor, Arnold Schwarzenegger. It gave them prior information to make a better voting decision. So the polling allowed them to consider rationally before Election Day what they were getting into. Yet knowing that Schwarzenegger was leading, they went on and voted him in anyhow. So that's an actual instance where I think pre-election polling out there performed a positive function for democracy in California.
How do you estimate absentee ballots in terms of estimating the eventual election in the fall?
That's a great thing about public opinion polling because it doesn't matter when you vote when we ask. So in other words, we call up and say, as of today, would you vote for Bush, Kerry? And if they say, well, I've already voted or I've sent a message, that's fine. They just tell us who they voted for. So we actually, polling allows us to pick up absentee ballots very nicely. Because we don't care whether you're telling us who you're going to vote for, who you've already, in Oregon or someplace where you've already voted for, we pick it up. We don't do a lot of work in trying to estimate what percent are going to be absentee ballots. Yeah, we can't pick those up. And someone was saying earlier, I wasn't aware of it, that there's a major campaign effort this year to get military and out-of-country people to mail in. We do not pick them up in our polling. So to the degree that out-of-country voting may be a more significant factor, we will miss it in our polling. There's no way around it. Yes? Well, all of our polls were of all national adults to begin with, and then we separate out registered voters, those who tell us they are registered to vote, or will be by the election, so that's a separate group. And then we distill down to a group of likely voters, so we actually report 3 sets of numbers. We don't only poll likely voters, we provide the users of our poll our best estimate for where the election would be if it were held today. Everybody knows not all registered voters vote. So we think in some ways it's not doing a service to the users of our data if we simply said, here's what would happen if all Americans voted. We think we're providing the users a service, but we're saying we're using our 60 years of experience at Gallup to try to estimate where the election would be if it were held today among those who are actually going to turn out to vote. And that's based on our estimate of likely voters. We do that based on a large historical sense of asking a bunch of questions that we have validated over the years, 7 different questions we put into a model, and based on those we come up with a pool of likely voters. It's a sensitive area. There's a lot of discussion, particularly on the internet, and criticism and accusations about whether likely voters works or not. Particularly with the Michael Moore thesis this year, he says there's going to be a huge insurge of young people that likely voter models are missing. So it's a controversial area, and we're monitoring it very carefully. But we still think that it's appropriate to provide both registered voters and among registered voters in the data I showed you, Bush was ahead by 8 points of John Kerry. Among likely voters, it was 13 points. So it was a 5-point difference in the gap. Bush gained a few. And that's typically the case among likely voters. The Republican gains. That Quinnipiac poll had Kerry up by 4 in New Jersey among registered voters. They said it was even among likely because Bush gained when you look at those most likely to turn out to vote. We think that it's appropriate to provide that information. Say this is our model of the people that vote. But like most everything else related to polling, there are many sides to that issue, and people look at it differently. Maybe one more question, because I know it's after 9 o'clock, and people have to go back to study for those that are students, right, into the night.
Do the young voters seem to be as split as the general, or are they more leaning towards one candidate or another?
Excellent question. We talked about it earlier. There is an assumption out there that young voters are all Kerry voters. That's what a lot of people say. If 18 to 29 flood the polls, that it's going to really help Kerry. We analyzed it. They are different from the general population. They are somewhat more Kerry, but not a lot. Anywhere from maybe 5 to 10 points towards Kerry among registered voters, where the tilt would be towards Bush among people that were older. So it is true, for every 100 voters that are 18 to 29, random sample of young voters that you bring to the poll, now let's argue that maybe 53 of them would vote for Kerry and 46 for Bush, or 55 for Kerry and 45 for Bush. So it's not monolithic by any means to Kerry. It tilts that direction, but there are a lot of young people still voting. More importantly is, if there are going to be more young people voting, who are they? And both sides are trying to mobilize young voters. So if more young people vote, they probably won't be a random sample of all young people. It will be young people that the Democrats managed to mobilize and get registered. Someone told me here at Richmond you had a registration day with both Democrats and Republicans. And this campus perhaps is not as democratically skewed as others, but I'm assuming people were registering at both tables. Is that right? Here? It wasn't all one or the other. So, but the Bush people are desperately trying to register young people who are more conservative. So it's a little unclear now what the impact is going to be if, in fact, young people turn out to vote based on who gets registered. But in answer to your question, 18 to 29s are somewhat, modestly more skewed to Kerry than the general population, but it's not dramatic. It's not, for example, like the African-American vote, which will be 90% to John Kerry, unless there's a dramatic change from all the smoking. All right, maybe it's time to, Fred, to stop here, and then we'll sign books and maybe talk to a few more questions.
Mentioned he does have some books in the lobby outside, and he'd be happy to sign them for you. Again, it's a very interesting book, and I recommend it to you. Before you leave tonight, I'd also like to remind you that we do have another session of the Jepson Leadership Forum tomorrow night at 7 p.m. in the Jepson Alumni Center. This program is entitled Presidents and the Presidency, the Challenges of Leadership Today. Ken Ruscio, Dean of the Jepson School and author of a new book on trust in government, will lead a discussion with 2 of the nation's authorities on power and leadership. Mark Landon, co-author of Presidential Greatness, and Charles O. Jones, a senior fellow at Brookings Institution, will join you in that discussion. I'm sure it'll be very interesting and insightful, and I hope that you'll be able to join us tomorrow night. Thanks again for joining us this evening. Have a safe trip home and enjoy the rest of the week.